why do we have a country built to accommodate the car if we can never find any damn parking anywhere? It doesn't make any sense. And the fact that, as you write, so much of our spaces are designated to literal parking lots and garages and things like that.
Yeah, I think the dream of free and easy parking has motivated a lot of very bad urban design decisions over the course of the 20th century. And, I get it. Everybody who drives obviously needs and wants a perfect place to park. Like parking people explain this by saying that people want parking to be free. They want it to be convenient, which is to say right in front of where they're going, and they want it to be available, which is to say open the moment they arrive. And it turns out that fulfilling all three of those qualities is extremely difficult because parking takes up a lot of space and it costs a lot of money to build. So achieving all three of those things turns out to be sort of impossible in any thriving place. And if you do manage to ensure that triple threat parking for anybody who wants it, you're going to end up with an urban environment that looks like your classic sprawling suburb with where the parking lots are larger than the buildings.
So I just got back from Los Angeles yesterday. I live here in Brooklyn. Those two areas of the country seem to have very unique problems with parking and cars that are quite different. I mean, what are the kind of identifiable problems in urban spaces like that when it comes to sprawl or private parking, things like that?
I think that most cities where it's tough to find parking have three common problems. The first is that parking is underpriced. Just say if you provide free parking in a location where everybody wants to park, like say on a busy commercial strip or residential street in Park Slope, you're going to force a lot of people. You're gonna create an incentive for people to leave their cars there for a long, long time, and rather than, for example, parking them in garages or even at out of the way spots. So um, when you underprice parking at attractive destinations, you create a localized supply and demand problem, or which is to say a supply shortage, and that has a lot of negative externalities. People driving a lot looking for parking, which adds literally millions of miles on the road just in a single neighborhood every year. So it's a massive contributor to traffic congestion, greenhouse gas emissions, et cetera. And that's all because the parking isn't properly priced. The second thing I'd say about that is that often the parking isn't shared. And so you get, like, you see this a lot in Los Angeles, where you'll have a lot that is proprietary, that belongs to a particular business or a particular residential building that can't be used by anybody else. And what this adds up to is an environment where there is a lot of parking, but it's not always accessible to you when you need a place to park. And that's a really common problem. We don't share parking in this country. And that's another reason that there may be a lot of it, but it also feels difficult to park. And then the last one is that parking is hard to find. And it's, what you can look for, like Google Maps will tell you how long it's going to take you to drive just about anywhere. And it'll be accurate down to a couple minutes. But there is no solution for parking, right? Like it remains this kind of opaque and unexplored terrain where local know-how is prized above all else. And I get it. Like I also love being able to know exactly where the best free parking is in my neighborhood too. But if you're running like a city, you don't really want every visitor to be dependent on that type of local knowledge to know where to leave their car.
Well, you want to try to incentivize at least some sort of public transit usage for people that are essentially touring the city, right? Like, what we talk increasingly about the urban centers as becoming kind of playgrounds for wealthy people who want to visit for the day. We talked about this in the context of the Jordan Neely story, in the context of how San Francisco is kind of constructed. And that's part of it too, right? Creating parking tourism or parking for tourism as opposed to parking for the people that live in these urban centers.
One of the problems with this system of a private lot associated with every home or business is that if you want to drive somewhere, you are unable to execute what is called a park once strategy, right? Like ideally, we would want you to be able to park your car, leave it there for 4 or 5 hours and then do the rest of your travel on foot, right? And go to a restaurant, go to a shop, take your kid to a music lesson, all that stuff. And that becomes impossible when every place you park is proprietary and belongs to the business where you've parked at, right? Because then you have to keep moving your car every time. So that's definitely bad. The other thing about parking is that if you're trying to get people on transit, for example, the number one determinant of whether people will drive is whether they have a place to park. It's like more than anything else. And this is true of parking at home. It's true of parking at the office. It's true of easy free parking in urban neighborhoods. If you build it, they will come in their cars.
So, what time period in the 20th century do you think that this parking lot obsession really started to gain steam and hit its fever pitch? How did it start like this?
Well, pretty much as soon as Americans started buying automobiles. I mean, the Model T comes out in 1908, and quickly people realized that because unlike horses, cars can be stored all night, all week, all month outside, there's going to be a major problem with people leaving their automobiles everywhere. And so the first half of the 20th century, American cities begin to confront this really disastrous traffic problem, which experts think is caused by people looking for parking, because you get downtown, there's no place to park, and you either circle and circle and circle, trying to find a place to park, or you just give up and you double park, in which case you are causing traffic congestion behind the place that you chose to leave your car. And then in the 1940s and 50s, cities come up with a solution, and they say, not only we're going to build some parking ourselves, but we're going to require every single property owner to include a certain amount of parking depending on what type of land use it is. So a restaurant needs to have a certain number of spots, and a home needs to have a certain number of spots, and an office building needs to have a certain number of spots. And so those laws didn't have an immediate effect because they didn't require it of every building on the spot. But every time a building was renovated, turned over to a new use, and obviously every time something was built new, it was required to come with an enormous amount of parking. That parking was built to suburban standards, and it ensured that for 60, 70 years, and in most cities and suburbs still today, building to a suburban standard of parking that assumes that everyone will be driving to and from your location is a requirement, and that is baked into the way we build things today. And that's the cause of a lot of the architecture and urbanism you see in this country today.
I mean, and can you give some examples of different areas and cities in which this kind of made its effects felt most acutely?
I think one of the most famous examples is Marina City in Chicago, which is the sort of corncob towers made famous, at least to me personally, because they were on the cover of Wilco's album Yankee Hotel Foxtrot. And those buildings are like parking up to here and then apartments above like that. And that's called a parking podium building. And if you go to any American downtown, I was just in downtown Cincinnati yesterday, and you will see this is like pretty typical of the post-war urban form. The buildings will have garages on floors 1 through 10 or 12, and then they'll have office or residential above that. So that's one example of how parking has worked its way into the architecture. Another one that is perhaps more consequential is with housing, right? Like if you want to build an apartment building, in most places you're required to include 1 to 2, sometimes more, parking spots with every new unit. And again, that not only has an impact on the urban form and on our transportation choices and on architecture, but it also costs a lot of money. Parking, structured parking can be $30,000, $50,000, $70,000 a stall. And if you're trying to build low-income housing, that becomes a massive cost center for your project and can reduce the number of units you're able to build at the end of the day.
So yeah, can you expand on that point, particularly about how parking has driven up rental prices broadly throughout the country and contributed to a lack of affordable housing in a lot of these areas?
Yeah, I think there's two things happening. I mean, number one, building parking costs a lot of money, and in most places it's required. And so the studies I've seen, like Seattle did a study showing that parking contributed 10 to 20% of the rent in new multifamily buildings. And so if you don't own a car, that's a lot of money you're paying just right off the bat for a useless garage space. And it's not like they'll let you store your furniture there or something. It has to be used for cars. It's like one function only. Other studies, California and Arizona, there was a federal study of low-income housing there that found structured parking added $70,000 onto the cost of every new unit, and so on. On and on and on. And obviously, this isn't just a problem once the projects get built. It also prevents a lot of stuff from getting built in the first place. Like, let's say you want to build a row of brownstones like you have in Brooklyn, or a triple decker, or a 3-flat like in Chicago, or a bungalow court in LA. Like, all these forms of early 20th century vernacular architecture, which are in many cases some of our most beloved housing typologies today, are impossible to build because they don't have enough parking. So there, it's not even a question of cost. It's just like, it's not going to happen. I mean, like, maybe you could build a gigantic underground garage underneath your row of brownstones, but again, you're going to pay out the nose for it, and you're going to wind up with a purely luxury housing typology. And people aren't going to want to park down there anyway, because everybody prefers to park at the curb. So this is a big problem. And then the second thing I'll say about this is that neighbors are so concerned about the parking shortage that they reject new housing on the grounds that it's going to challenge their claim to the existing public parking supply. And I think that is a dynamic you see in every city and suburb in the country when a new building is proposed. People view new neighbors as coming in 2,000-pound steel packages, and it leads the way to what we might call NIMBYism, or even more fundamentally, like a kind of Malthusian view about how much room there is in the city, because you're not thinking about room for people, you're thinking about room for cars.
That's interesting. I'd never thought about it that way. I mean, how does that in particular, well, it contributes to NIMBYism, I would guess, broadly, but does it contribute in the specific way that I guess it's targeted towards affordable housing or lower income housing as well?
I mean, you could spend all day trying to parse the motivations of neighbors who get up at the community meeting and say, this project doesn't have enough parking, so we need to turn it down and say no. And there are definitely cases. There are stories that I tell in my book where it's very clear that neighbors' motivations aren't entirely about parking. At the same time, I think there's a lot of cases where people genuinely get wound up about their claim to street parking, and they worry that new neighbors are going to take away what they've been given for free because they moved to the neighborhood earlier, and they feel they have a claim on that curbside parking. So both those things are happening at once, but I think it's really a major factor, and it's totally unstudied, and it's very hard to come up with firm data on this. But if you've ever been to a city council meeting or a community meeting where a new project is discussed, I guarantee you parking will be top of mind, if not the single dominant concern from neighbors about what's being proposed.